welcome to the Workplace Options podcast. My name is James Callender. I'm the Director of Business Solutions for Australia and New Zealand, and I'm joined by my colleague, Katie. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you, James.
We are here to have a chat about the benefits of a real-time EAP, removing time as a barrier to accessing support. Katie, can you share with our listeners your role and your experience across the EAP industry?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me today. So I'm Katie, and I'm the Service Centre Director for Australia and New Zealand for Workplace Options. And my role ensures making sure that everything is running smoothly across our region, from the very first touch point of someone calling in or receiving materials to the very end of support. So it's making sure that everyone is well equipped and able to deliver their role and job as best as they can. I've been working in the EAP space for over 5 years. So I've worked in a combination of small businesses and now a large global provider. And I've worked across a range of roles, including sales, account management, operations, and service delivery. I was on the committee of EPA, which is the regulatory body of EAPs for Australia and New Zealand, for 4 years. And through my time, I've worked with a big range of clients and partner organisations.
So we're in great hands here to dive straight into the benefits of a real-time EAP. Thanks for sharing, Katie. Katie, to set the stage, can you please explain what a triage EAP looks like, which may be a model that some of our listeners are more familiar with, versus that of a clinician-answered EAP?
Definitely. So you're right in that a triage EAP is a more traditional model globally, and it's also the predominant model in Australia and New Zealand. So what it is most EAP providers anywhere will have a 24-hour number that employees and clients can call into to start accessing services. The EAP standards, which are essential criteria to consider when choosing an EAP provider, stipulate that either trained administrators or clinicians are available to answer these calls. So what most EAPs will do is use intake or administrative staff who have completed crisis support or some kind of similar training. That person will take the initial call from the employee or the client and then book them in for services with the next available clinician. These calls generally range from around 5 to 20 minutes. Depending on the clinician and client availability, this first appointment will generally be about 7 days after the initial call. However, a clinician-answered model is where the 24/7 line is staffed by clinicians only. The initial call will go through to a clinician who's available to complete a thorough intake and have a clinical conversation in the moment with the person who's called. These intake conversations will generally last around 30 to 60 minutes. Depending on the clinical judgment of the clinician who's taking the call and the needs assessed of the person calling, the client may then be booked in for short-term sessions or linked into longer-term support and resources, or set down a variety of other referral pathways.
And thinking about that experience, a member would be quite surprised, really, in terms of who picks up the call or the interaction and what their experience is like moving forward. Can you help paint the picture for the differences in the employee experience when calling a clinician-answered EAP versus that of a traditional triage model?
Definitely. So as I mentioned before, one of the key differences is generally the length of the intake conversation. So I am speaking very broadly here, but having worked across and with both of the models, a call to an administrative staff member is usually just the person calling, requesting to book in a session, and then a confirmation of that. As I said, the first session is generally around a week later, and the initial call is like 10 minutes. It's very brief. But a call to a clinician-answered model will be significantly longer. The clinicians are trained to have a thorough and in-depth conversation with the person who's calling. And I know at WPO, everything that we do is centered on the idea that something's happened at that point in time on that certain day that's made that person decide to call and pick up the phone. If they're finally taking that step to pick up the phone and then only having a 10-minute conversation, they're not really getting to the bottom of what's happening to them in that specific moment. But if a clinician's answering the call and they might have to do some digging, they can usually identify what the person's experiencing and then provide them with some immediate and in-the-moment coping strategies. A lot of the time, what we'll see now is that after the clinicians had this in-depth conversation, which can be anywhere between half an hour to 2 hours, the caller feels well equipped to work through what they were calling for, and they don't actually proceed with booking the short-term sessions because they think that they feel fine and they know that they can call back in if they need to for a chat at any point. They can book in these sessions. Of course, they're available and they have a whole range of services, but a lot of the time people feel content and happy that they've already addressed an issue from that initial call. Another difference for the employee experience, I'd say, would be the range of issues that can be addressed by a clinician answered model. I've worked with excellent administrative staff who were very well trained and very good, but some of the calls that come through might be in regard to a more acute or sensitive topic, such as domestic violence or self-harm. Unless specific training's been received on some of these topics, it's really difficult for the person answering the call to triage appropriately. Most of the time, what will happen is they either transfer the call or pass the phone to a more senior staff member, but this can take time and it's pretty disjointed for the person who's calling and maybe in distress. If the call is getting straight through to a clinician instead, then they have the space to dive into a lengthier conversation and work through those solutions such as safety planning for higher risk situations and callers. The person who answers the call is the person that they speak to for the whole time, and at WPO, they're a guaranteed master's level clinician who's had years of study and training to equip them with the skills to handle those more difficult calls. The most simple example is if someone calls the 24-hour number crying and in distress, the clinicians can work through those heightened emotional states as they're doing it pretty often, so they can help the person move through what they're experiencing, whereas an administrative person might struggle to do the same, especially if they have less training.
So we're really respecting the bravery that it takes for an employee or their family member to reach out for support in that moment.
Absolutely. And I think we probably don't focus on that enough, but the strength that it takes for someone to pick up the phone and take that first step is such an opportunity for us to make sure that we're connecting with them and helping them in the way that we should be. And what breaks my heart is when you hear stories of people who took that first step and they weren't treated appropriately, which might be the person on the end of the phone was great at their job, but they just didn't know how to help that person in that moment.
And this is available 24 hours a day, isn't it? It's not something that is just available during operating hours, because at times our mental health presentations don't necessarily stick to the time box of 9 till 5. They come up before work or at home after work. Can you help us understand from a psychological standpoint, how does speaking directly to a clinician impact the mental health outcomes of employees seeking support?
So really, it's providing them a solution in that moment, as we've sort of talked about, which is what's impacting their day. Also, another psychological thing that I would say that comes out of it is that people are often better at describing their concerns and triggers when they're active rather than recalling it on another day. So if they're in that position of being in a heightened distress, then they can describe exactly what they're feeling, exactly what's upsetting them in a more clear way, which makes it easier for the clinician on the phone to treat and give them those coping strategies. Also, distress and dysfunction can get worse over time. We've seen that in studies, and immediate support can help to relieve the distress and correct that dysfunction before it progresses into other issues. A good example of that is trauma, and when trauma might first happen, if someone's calling through and getting through to a clinician in that moment, that clinician can help them with those immediate responses to trauma rather than letting it sit and progress and get worse and worse, and potentially it can turn into PTSD down the track.
It really is something that is quite unique and potentially businesses haven't considered in the past, with EAPs for the last 40 years being a tick box exercise for some organizations and not actually considering what the end-to-end member experience is and the mindset or the mindset of the employee who is calling. What is the best experience for them when they do pick up that phone or open that chat box to have a conversation?
Absolutely. As I say, I've worked in EAP for a long time and across both models, and it probably wasn't something that I started to consider until I started working for WPO. and the actual impact that having a clinician answer the phone has on the person calling. From a logistics and operations perspective, it's definitely not easier to staff the phones with clinicians than it is with admin staff. So I can see why a lot of organizations don't do it, but the outcomes that I've seen personally have been phenomenal. And I feel that we really are delivering a great level of care to those people.
And that is probably quite a good segue into the broader business conversation, because naturally, when we are working with organizations and partners, they look to understand the engagement levels and the utilization levels of programs. They use that as a benchmark of considering the capability and the performance of one provider versus the other. So, Katie, in your experience, how does clinician involvement at the first point of contact improve engagement and utilization rates compared to a traditional triage system?
So, as we've talked about, the clinician-answered model can help make sure that people are getting the help they're seeking in that immediate moment. So it means that we're addressing the presenting issue and can help them work through that process while they're on the phone. In a triage model, the person might be calling with a concern in mind, but they're waiting around a week before their first session. So if the issue is something like work stress, or if it's like conflict with a partner or something similar to that, there's a pretty high likelihood that the issue will have at least changed, maybe even resolved in the week between the initial call and the first appointment. If someone's feeling nervous about a meeting that they have in 2 days and they just call up the EAP and book in the session and then they have that meeting, they haven't really done anything to mitigate the stress or the anxiety that they were feeling. As a result, traditional models do tend to see that high drop-off in the attendance of clients to the first session if they are moving forward with that short-term therapy. So going back to that meeting example, if someone's called in and then they've spoken to someone and they've just booked them in for a session, but diaries weren't able to work and then they booked it in for the week later, they might just not turn up to that first session because they've already had the meeting and they think that they're feeling better, and they'll either cancel the appointment or they won't turn up. So they might call to cancel and then they just never book back in. So they've lost that engagement. And while mental health guidelines are very stringent in terms of not forcing people into therapy who don't want to engage and things like that, the idea is that someone called when they're in distress and now they haven't received the best support that they probably could have in that moment. Clinician-answered models probably then see a higher rate of engagement and utilization because they're calling through and getting straight onto a clinician. So in that meeting example again, they've called through, they're speaking to someone who's trained and qualified, and they're giving them coping strategies in that first chat. This is the benefit of this is also a benefit of organizations having an EAP in place rather than a mental health helpline that governments and charities might run around the world, which are staffed by volunteers, is that the EAP is always going to provide a higher level of support. And people can call when they're in distress and receive what we call single session therapy. So it's that chat with the clinician that can be anywhere between 20 minutes to 2 hours, and it's thoroughly addressing risk, the presenting issue, and any other factors that might be affecting the caller. So if someone does have that big chat initially, they get their coping strategies, they can then make the decision if they want to book in for short-term therapy, but at least they've been provided with those coping strategies for the gap between that call and the first session. So the clinician-answered models generally do see a much higher engagement rate and a lower cancellation rate for the first session. And this will remain consistent throughout the duration of treatment as well. Even if it's not the first session, they might have had 2 or 3. And sometimes in a traditional triage model, they will drop off because they think that they're feeling better. But if they've had a clinician-answered model, they've had that big chat, they know exactly what short-term goal they're trying to achieve in their short-term sessions, then we do see that they tend to retain engagement for a longer period of time.
And so for our stakeholders who are evaluating their current EAP or looking at a new EAP, there's a number of metrics that they can be inquiring about beyond the headline utilization and engagement statistics. So we've just heard from you, Katie, talking about average talk time or length of conversation is one metric. You're talking about the presentation rate to your first session. Yeah. You're talking about the number of sessions that individuals are going to. Mm-hmm. So these are all statistics that you can dive into to have a deeper understanding of the performance of your current program and how that compares to the elevated performance of a clinician-answered EAP model.
Definitely. And I know also we take data in the first and last session. So in that initial intake call that the clinician's doing as part of, we do the risk assessment, but we also basically do the equivalent of a wellbeing check. And then we do that at the end of their short-term sessions as well. So you're actually gathering scores of how someone's feeling. And of course you have to take them with a grain of salt, but you can see the real impact that those short-term sessions have had on those people. And that as a global percentage is what I know, look at in Workplace Options quite a lot, is trying to make sure that people are genuinely getting the benefit out of those sessions. And you need a clinician taking the initial call to be able to do that.
Earlier, I mentioned some market feedback that EAPs are underutilized. So, Katie, in your experience, can you help us understand some of the common misconceptions around EAPs and how the clinician answer model addresses those?
Definitely. I think a big one is stigma and confidentiality. A lot of people think that if they access the EAP, it will somehow get back to their organization. And a big part of what mitigates that with a clinician-answered model is that clinicians are bound by governing bodies. So in Australia, we have things like the Health Practitioner Regulation Agency or bodies like the Australian Counselling Association, and all of our clinicians are registered and then bound by those guidelines and standards around confidentiality. Not that it goes back to the organisation anyway. Across both models, I know that it doesn't. The only thing that will go back is quantities, and there is full confidentiality, but people are legally and ethically responsible in the clinician-answered model to not let that data go anywhere, and definitely not back to the organisation. So I think that's a big one. Another one would be that people think that accessing the EAP is either it's only for work-related issues, or I know people have called through before saying that they didn't feel like their issue was bad enough to call the EAP. And I think having someone on the phone who has those years of training and qualifications across a broad range of topics really makes sure that the person who might have been hesitant to make that first call is being treated in a way that they're valid. It's for a whole range of issues. It's personal, it's work, it's family, whatever you need to call for. And of course, there's no such thing as being bad enough. You can call when you're feeling good to even just test the service or to have a chat. That's exactly what it's there for. And the clinicians will be able to help you talk through that process. Whereas an administrative person probably wouldn't have the same skill set to be able to maybe justify or validate any of those people calling in who might feel quite uncertain about taking that step. And then probably the third misconception that I would say would be that people think that the EAP isn't effective for managers or executives, that it's only that general entry-level worker, which again is not true for a clinician-answered model. Some of our clinicians have 40 years experience, and a lot of them had their first life maybe as a lawyer or a banker or performing arts, or a lot of them had successful careers before they then moved into mental health services and being a clinician. And so they all have quite extensive experience and qualifications. They have to have a master's, and they were working closely with people who are in that leadership cohort as well. They might be delivering trainings, they might be doing executive coaching, it could be any of those things as well. And that also comes through the different services that we offer, such as manager support and things like that. But those clinicians answering the phone are more than qualified to help those people, those managers, those executives, and they've had plenty of experience doing it, which an administrative staff, it might be an undergraduate person or something like that studying psychology, they're probably not going to have either the clinical or the life experience to be able to help someone in that role.
And I wanted to pick up, Katie, there on your point regarding supporting managers, because the presentations that managers often come in with are quite timely. It is, I'm dealing with a particular employee, maybe I've got some performance management issues, and how can I help navigate that? So having a 24/7 clinician answered model essentially gives you the ability to get that support and that advice immediately, as opposed to waiting for your 5-day SLA to turn around to have a booked appointment. Would you agree?
Definitely. I think I would agree that predominantly managers are calling through for performance reviews, or they've just had an employee send an angry email to someone else, or they need to give feedback and things like that, which are, you're right, they can't afford to wait those 5 days. They're busy people, they're managing a lot, and being able to just call and have a chat with someone who can help them with that in the moment rather than getting maybe passed around or booked in is definitely a real benefit to the clinician answered model.
And we see success out of that manager assistance program in individuals seeking to be more proactive as well, because if we were to reflect on one of those misconceptions is that EAP is only there for reactive situations. So being able to access a service in real time for the good times to help you drive those high performing teams if you are in a people leadership capacity, or to respond to those more immediate moments, having access to those clinicians immediately delivers more timely business outcomes than those that you're waiting for an appointment.
Definitely. And that's the thing. It's making sure that people feel prepared going into those situations as well as coming out of them. So whether they are calling someone to have that chat before they're going into that meeting, it's making sure that they're feeling equipped as a manager to go and handle that situation as well, rather than going in feeling unprepared, the conversation going poorly, and then they're coming to us. So it gives you the opportunity to get in front of it before it's happening.
And let's not forget that the Australian workforce isn't all 9 to 5. There are a lot of people here in employed Australia that are working shift work. They are working outside of the usual operating hours. And potentially with a typical triage model, you're speaking to an admin person out of hours when you finished your shift at a mine site. The available appointments are only during operating hours of 9 till 5. So you're potentially not giving your employees equitable access to the service that you're paying for. Whereas with a 24/7 clinician answered model, those employees, whenever they finish their shift, as an example, or even during their shift after hours, can access those clinicians immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you make a really good point about the appointments being available. Generally, a lot of clinics and things like that are between 9 to 5. They might do some after hours on a Thursday. They might do some weekends. But yeah, for people who are working at your local grocery store or petrol stations or anywhere really in shift work, being able to finish a shift even at 4 a.m. and maybe you just had a fight with a colleague on your shift and you finish at 4 a.m. and you want to go out and call someone and have a chat to them, and you're getting straight through to someone who can help you in that moment. They're not just going to take your information, call you back on Monday morning and book you in an appointment in a week away again. So it is really providing people with that immediate support across a range of time zones and things and jobs required and things like that as well.
And potentially, if you do have a typical triage model at the moment, and you do have low utilization, potentially it's because your employees are accessing after hour support, but through another means, through one of those community-based mental health support services, and not going through the workplace wellbeing provider.
Definitely. And, you know, those community mental health lines absolutely have a place. They're important. They serve an important purpose. But as I say, a lot of the time they're not as qualified as the EAP. So if your organization is paying for an EAP, then you should absolutely be maximizing on that and making sure that your people have access to those qualified professionals at all hours of the day. And that's just making sure that your people are being supported in a good way when they need it.
Katie, you're an incredible font of knowledge. Is there a particular success story that comes to mind to you which highlights the effectiveness of a clinician-answered EAP?
I think there's a few. I think, of course, people calling in and sometimes when they call in and they say, I don't know what's wrong, I just don't feel great, and having a clinician having the skills to be able to dig into that further and really work with them on it to find out what it is that's affecting them. You know, is it a lack of purpose or meaning, or are they maybe not feeling complete in their relationship or something like that. I think them having the skills to be able to do that is really important. Personally, for me, what sticks out in my brain, when I used to answer the phones myself as an administrative person a long time ago, I'd completed a psychology degree and I'd done multiple courses on crisis support and things like that. People calling up in distress, whether they're crying or they're upset or they've just had a fight with their partner or their manager or something, I never felt fully equipped to be able to help those people because I hadn't done the years of training and I wasn't doing it day in, day out. So I think someone calling and crying and having to say, as the person who answered the phone call, can you just hang on a second while I find someone to transfer you to, or I'll get someone to call you back. It's just not really good enough. So I think those people really should be able to, the difference that it makes for that person calling who's in tears for whatever reason and being able to get onto a clinician who can really, really help them in that moment and really make them feel better and give them those coping strategies. And whether they want to follow that up with extra support or things like that, I think the difference is phenomenal. That's probably the best example in my mind. It's stayed with me forever. And it's why I'm so passionate about what we're doing with the clinician answered model compared to the traditional triage model, because, the triage model works, but the clinician answered model is better. And I feel really strongly about that, which is why I'm fortunate to be working in the role that I am.
Katie, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us here and also providing both the industry regulatory view out of the EAP standards, but also some of the great work that WPO has been doing across our clients here in Australia, but also globally. It's no small feat to be covering over 80 million lives around the world, 24 hours a day, in multiple languages. So for our listeners, if there are listeners who are currently sitting in a benefits or a people risk or a HR capacity, and you are interested in learning more about the benefits of a workplace wellbeing program or an EAP that removes time as a barrier to accessing support, you can reach out on our website and we're more than happy to give you a demonstration of how it works. Katie, thank you very much once again.
Thanks, James.